Egypt had gained nominal independence from Britain back in 1922, but there was still an imperial presence with British troops guarding the essential waterway, the Suez Canal. In 1952, there was a revolution in Egypt, and King Farouk was overthrown by an army coup led by General Gamal Abdel Nasser, who became the country's new president. Nasser saw great things for Egypt's future, desiring it to become the dominant force in a pan-Arab movement in the Middle East and North Africa, which would unify the Arab world. There were, however, three obstacles in his way. One was the colonial presence of French control in Algeria. The second was the Jewish state of Israel and the Palestinian refugee crisis. And the third was the remaining British colonial presence in Egypt. In October 1954, Nasser obtained a pledge from the British to relinquish its rights to maintain a military base on the essential waterway, the Suez Canal, and also to evacuate the canal zone entirely within 20 months. In exchange, Egypt promised Britain guaranteed freedom of navigation through the Suez Canal, and promised to allow British forces immediate re-entry to the canal zone in the event of an armed outside attack. In June 1956, the British formally terminated their 74-year occupation of the Suez Canal, leaving Egypt fully responsible for the canal's defense. Very soon, however, the British forces would be back invading the canal zone following Nasser's move to nationalize the canal company. President Nasser's ambitious Aswan Dam project led Egypt to nationalizing the Suez Canal. Once he had lost American financial assistance because of an arms deal concluded with a Soviet bloc nation. The canal company, the Suez Canal Company, was largely owned by European shareholders, and the British and French governments also wanted to overthrow Nasser and to install a more favorable regime. For France, this was particularly important because of the assistance Nasser was giving to Arabs in the region and to Algeria in particular. Thus, the joint invasion of Egypt by France, Britain, and Israel was easily achieved, but was soon abandoned as the United States forced France and Britain to withdraw. Tensions between Egypt and Israel did not ease. There was no peace settlement after the 1956 war, and so both sides geared up for the next war, which came in June 1967, once United Nations peacekeepers were withdrawn from Egyptian territory. Throughout much of the 20th century, China struggled to be a unified, functioning state. There was great political instability from the overthrow of the monarchy in 1911 through to the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. During the chaotic 1910s and 1920s, two groups emerged to lead and unify the country, the nationalists and the communists. Civil war broke out between the nationalists and communists during the mid-1920s. Communist strength was most successfully established in rural areas, and its supporters were able to utilize guerrilla tactics to neutralize the superior strengths of the nationalists. When Japan invaded China in 1937 in an undeclared war, the Chinese nationalists and communists managed an uneasy truce to work together to try and to fight the Japanese invader. With the defeat of Japan in 1945, the Chinese Civil War reignited and lasted until the communists were victorious, pushing Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist forces onto the island of Taiwan and the creation of the People's Republic of China. The real hotspot in the early Cold War in Asia was undoubtedly the Korean Peninsula. Korea was the key test to Truman's policy of containing communism. Like Germany, the liberation of Korea from World War II created its own geopolitical problem. Once Japanese forces were driven from the Korean Peninsula, for expediency it was proposed that Soviet troops temporarily occupy the northern part of Korea, down to the 38th parallel, and American troops would temporarily occupy the southern half. Both occupying powers established a government in its own zone, which were essentially client states in the north and the south. The Soviets installed a government under Communist Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, In 1947, a United Nations Commission sought to sponsor nationwide elections to reunify the country. However, the Soviets would not allow outside supervision of elections in the northern half of the country. Indeed, the Soviets also prevented free and fair elections in nations it liberated from Nazi occupation in Europe after World War II, as it realized that communist governments would never actually be freely elected anywhere. An American-backed authoritarian leader, Syngman Rhee, was elected in the south of the country, and both American and Soviet forces left the Korean peninsula, however, leaving behind well-equipped and trained Korean armies in the north and the south. Thus, despite the original intention of elections to unify the country, in essence like Germany, two Koreas now existed. War erupted in June 1950, when the forces of North Korea invaded the south. There had been border skirmishes in the past, but this was full-scale invasion to unify the country under the communist northern government. In the West, this was seen as an open act of military aggression, the first clear-cut example of military action of the Cold War. With a well-equipped army, the northern forces expected a quick victory. They had gambled that the United States would not intervene, and world opinion would simply allow the communists to control all of Korea. Instead, what happened was a concerted effort led by the United States, and with the United Nations approval, to employ countermeasures. In an important example of bad timing for the Soviets, the Soviet Union was not present at the United Nations Security Council to veto the authorization of military countermeasures in Korea against the North Koreans, which it most certainly would have done. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council because it was protesting the fact that the UN seat for China was still given to the non-communist Chinese government centered on the island of Taiwan. That is, the nationalists who had lost the Chinese Civil War were the ones who were actually representing China at the United Nations, rather than the victorious communist government. And Soviets were boycotting the United Nations because of what they saw as this injustice. So, from the American perspective, the region was already becoming more unstable with the triumph of communist forces under Mao Zedong in China in 1949, and Korea became a test of the free world's commitment to prevent the spread of communism. The war progressed, and in 1951, a ceasefire agreement ended large-scale fighting, though one sticking point in negotiations was the fact that North Korean prisoners of war did not want to be returned to the communist North. In 1953, under Eisenhower's presidency, an armistice was signed and a line of partition was drawn at the 38th parallel, which was roughly where the fighting had begun 3 years previously. The partition hardened into another long-term division as North Korea became a rigid, closed communist dictatorship and South Korea developed into a dynamic capitalist economy. The war, technically, is still going on, as there is simply an armistice. The Korean War was a significant stimulator for economic growth in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. It also provided reassurance for Western Europeans who had been concerned that the United States would return to an isolationist position after World War II and leave them at the mercy of the growing Soviet hegemony in Europe. It was a firm American response to a communist military invasion. From the communist world perspective, the Korean War was a draw which prevented the USA from reasserting Western imperial supremacy in the East. Many nations were skeptical of American rhetoric of maintaining a free world, rather seeing American actions as a masked drive to create world markets for American capitalism, to secure markets for American companies to sell to. The Korean War inaugurated an era of deep American involvement in Asia and served as a prelude to the longer and more costly conflict, the Vietnam War, in which the USA also became embroiled to prevent the spread of communism in Asia. As the text notes, there were similarities between Japan and Germany following World War II, particularly the fact that it was occupied. The developing Cold War politics, however, transformed Japan, from the American perspective, from an impoverished enemy to a prosperous ally following the Korean War, as the Americans increasingly came to see a role for Japan as a counterweight to communist Soviet Union and China's influence in Asia. China and the Soviet Union were both communist nations, but they were not always the warmest of friends, and their relationship deteriorated over time, from a partnership to a rivalry. During the 1940s, the Soviet government played off both sides in the Chinese Civil War, befriending both in an attempt to prolong the war or to at least prevent a unified and powerful neighbor. Once the communists won the war, and the Americans saw their interest to be more and more with a West-friendly Japan, China and the Soviet Union had a good relationship, particularly during the 1950s, with the Soviets providing China with economic and diplomatic support in return for Chinese recognition that the Soviet Union was the leader of the communist world.